Hi everyone. Sorry, I had to cancel class today. It's the first time I've been sick in years, but I guess it's well, not first time, but first time in a while for everything. So today I'm just going to screencast the lecture I would have given you, and I want you to, write down any notes or questions you have. We don't have class on Monday, so please bring any notes or discussion materials for Wednesday when we meet next time. And we'll go over that, and we'll start going over structuralism. So today, this is just about the sociological imagination. So this is sort of normally where we would start in a normal intro to sociology class. And it's just very basically what sociologists do and our mindset in doing it. And so I always like to start with common sense in this quote by Albert Einstein. So he says that common sense is the collection of prejudices acquired by the age of 18. And Berger separately says, it can be said that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem. And so I highlight this because we come into anything, especially things we already have a lot of experience with a common sense notion of how it works, why it is the way it is, just everything. We think we understand the full phenomenon basically in a common sense way. And common sense is very dangerous because it closes down your mind from being open to alternate explanations. Politically, you'll see this come up in a lot of different ways where people will say, well, that's just common sense. And what they really mean is, I don't have reasons for this. I've never thought about this. I am not open to challenges on this. I think this, and I'm not going to consider it any further. It is true for me. It is true for the world. I'm done thinking about it. And that is completely antithetical to the sociological point of view. We need to be open to the things that are most familiar to us. And so these are some Gestalt images. I was going to have you look at these. I'm sure you've seen all these before, but there's two different images going in here, and a lot of times you start and you see only one, especially if you don't know that it's a Gestalt image, and then suddenly you see the other one. So the first one, of course, we have the gorilla. Well, it's a tree at first. That's maybe the most obvious. And a couple birds up top. Then there's a gorilla and a lion. The second one is the woman in the mirror, and of course it makes a skull. And the third one is an old couple looking at each other, and of course there's what looks to me like a mariachi player on the right, and a guy holding up the old lady's wrinkles or something on his head on the left. Is it a pot? I don't know. But it's not exactly as it appears it would be. So we do what's called the flip. And so to quote Berger, the sociologist does not look at phenomena that nobody else is aware of, but he looks at the same phenomenon in a different way. We see the strange in the familiar, and the familiar in the strange. And again, this is one of the things that makes it so difficult, and which makes us in some ways a marginalized discipline, because we talk about things that everyone thinks they already fully understand, and they consider common sense, even if that common sense functions differently for each person. So I may think one thing is common sense, you may think another thing is common sense. Not another thing, but a different explanation for the exact same phenomenon is common sense. I mean, the big thing is like gun control right now. I may think, I won't even put myself in this. Person X may think gun control is just common sense, and person Y may think gun control is just a completely absurd and dangerous, and that's also common sense, right? And so, clearly both can't be common sense. They both can't be true. And so to get at this strange and familiar and strange, sociology approached this systematically and empirically to study the relationships of individuals, social entities, aggregated from individuals, and the physical world with which we all must contend. And this is something I was going to have you do, but I won't. Maybe I'll have you do it later. And so how do we do this? So we must cultivate what many have called the sociological imagination. And so you didn't read about this, but I always like to start with saying you have to fight your inherent confirmation bias. And this is a tendency to accept information that fits with your worldview and reject information that does not fit with your worldview and interpret, and this is actually some new evidence in the confirmation bias, and to even interpret counter evidence as supportive of your worldview. I mean, it's quite some mental jujitsu to get there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. In fact, talk about more of all of these in a second. The second is to cultivate a certain sense of creativity. The third is you take a skeptical stance towards whatever it is you're studying. Fourth, you use a critical mind. And fifth, you are disciplined, which means you employ all this consistently. So we're going to actually talk a little bit more about confirmation bias when we get to rational actor theory. Confirmation bias is one of the affect heuristics. And again, this will make more sense later, but it's one of the ways in which we receive information non-rationally, and I don't like to say irrationally, because that makes it sound like we're stupid, but non-rationally, because it's just not the sort of accepted mechanism for assessing information. It turns out that that we have oftentimes very good reasons for using affect heuristics, and we'll also read about that with Valerie Raymond's work. So, you know, why don't facts determine our beliefs? There's a number of reasons. I think this is one of the rare instances where I will invoke evolutionary psychology. I'm not a big fan of evolutionary psychology in general because I think it can make some dangerous arguments. But here I think this is one I like. So this is my own confirmation bias, right? But in the past, when circumstances were more dire, when the stakes were higher, when it was a zero-sum game between life and death, oftentimes, your worldview was it was very important not to change it unless it really needed to be changed. So, you know, if you think the world functions in a certain way, and that's keeping you alive, then changing the way you think the world functions in some fundamental way can be very dangerous because you don't know the outcome. But now, you know, obviously, we don't live in a world where the stakes are so dire. You can change your worldview, you can mess around with different things, and you're not going to get eaten by a beast, you know, unless you really change something fundamental like, you know, how does gravity work? You're not going to fall off a precipice. Gravity does work, by the way. Now we can change some of our fundamental beliefs without, you know, threatening our very existence. But that's not to say that it's not hard, you know, or that it's easy. You know, if you change some fundamental beliefs, you may wind up in arguments with friends or family. You may wind up, you know, just being really mad at the world. You realize that it hasn't functioned the way that you always thought it functioned, especially if that gave you comfort in some way, or you know, or just served you psychologically in some way. So it's not to say that altering your belief is easy, but it doesn't have quite the dire consequences that it did when, you know, life was a little bit more all or nothing. So why don't facts determine our beliefs? That's one reason. And just to clarify this, I showed this study by Lord Ross and Leopard. It's a slightly old study. They showed that people's opinions on the death penalty, they assessed studies, this is just an example of confirmation bias, they assessed studies that challenge their beliefs more critically than studies that affirm them. So this, I mean, again, just to go back to my evolutionary psychology example, you know, I read evolutionary psychology, and to give an example of one I don't like, there's this one that's like, you know, women like to shop because back in, you know, our pre-civilized days, they were the gatherers while the men was the hunters. I mean, first off, that's sort of, we can't know that. again, if you look at contemporary, quote unquote, uncivilized societies, primitive societies, men do plenty of gathering. They actually, as a whole, don't do a lot of hunting. But anyway, that's beside the point. The point is we can't know that, and that just seems sort of ad hoc. It just seems like we are starting with this premise that our current gender divisions are accurate, and so we'll just read backwards and map them onto our primitive past. So my confirmation bias is like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Whereas the other study that I cited, about pre-evolutionary past, about shaking up your worldview, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So even there, I'm sort of using my confirmation bias. I'm assessing information critically that I don't like, and not assessing information as critically that I do like, or that makes sense to me. I read more on this, so it's not like completely did this, but I'm just showing that this is very natural. And with people this is newer research, for people with strong belief, counter evidence actually strengthens their belief somehow. So they redid this study on death penalty research, and what they did was they had people read articles that were supposed to be true, or they said, treat these as true. I think they were told they were true. That either gave evidence of studies that showed the death penalty did reduce crime in areas, which, by the way, it doesn't seem to, or the death penalty did not reduce crime in areas. And they found that, of course, if those, and they were fake studies, by the way, although real studies have been done on this, but they showed that the fake studies, if they confirmed what you already believed, of course, you said, hey, this says that, the death penalty is good, or the death penalty is bad. But it turns out, even if they did not support what you said, so you support the death penalty, and you read the article that says, actually it does no good, or vice versa, you'd think the death penalty does no good, and then you read the set of research that says, actually, it deters crime quite effectively. Somehow people rationalize this to have it support their own belief. And not only that, but they were more staunch in their beliefs, in their prior beliefs, than the people who got the articles that just supported what they already thought. So in the face of counter evidence, you really double down. And, so this is, my point here is that this is really a natural human tendency, and something that we have to be very aware of as we enter this. Especially in a class like this, we'll talk about things that may challenge your belief system. And, I'm not here to colonize your mind and tell you what's true of the world as such. But I would ask that you would be open to it and consider it on its own terms before, deciding yes, no, whatever. And again, even things that you're supportive of, you should also be critical of those too. And we'll have many opportunities in class to pick apart, all sides of the readings. And I really encourage you to do that in a constructive way, of course. And so finally, the last bullet point on this. So why don't experts clear up these debates, right? So we have experts who make it their entire career to go study this stuff. So why don't we just turn to the experts and say, well, there you go. Okay, that's Dan Kahan right here. Let's say he does research in risk perception and social psychology. So Dan Kahan, he knows his stuff. Why don't we just trust him? Well, he shows that you're more likely to believe an expert if they already affirm your prior beliefs. So similar to the last study, if an expert says something you don't already believe, what are you going to do? You're going to wonder who paid them. Maybe they're paid by corporations, or they're paid by someone with a special interest, or maybe they're paid by George Soros, the liberal sort of guy who is accused of all this. You're going to question their education. You're going to question their data, whatever. You're going to do all this stuff, but and that's not necessarily bad. But the thing is, you're not going to do that for the experts that say what you want them to say, or what you already believe. So creativity. I'm going to save this because I actually do want to go through this. This is sort of a fun thing where and have you guys sort of guess what's really going on. This is one of my favorite photos on the internet. Okay, we'll attack that on Wednesday. So you cultivate a skeptical stance. And I like to call this agnosticism because this is what really agnosticism really means. So it's not about whether or not you believe in God or God exists. It's the more general and original meaning of this, which is a benign skepticism and doubt, not only towards the concepts you don't like, but the concepts you do like and your own assumptions. So this is what I was getting at when you, just a moment ago, when I said, when you encounter new information, you are willing to suspend your belief or disbelief and meet it on its own terms and see, what the argument is trying to say, and judge it by its own merits, and then re-enter with your beliefs, and then be willing, if you think objectively, and none of us can be objective, but if you think it is objectively possible, that challenges your beliefs or affirms your beliefs, you're willing to factor that in. In the end, most of the assignments I give you, you will not have to, I won't force you to argue something you don't believe. I will force you to explain to me what I've taught you, though. And then you can take a stance, or you can respond to it, or whatever. But of course, first you have to show a good faith understanding of the course materials, and that's pretty normal, I think. And then, of course, Berger calls this Nietzsche's art of mistrust. So it really is an art. If it's not deployed in these ways that I'm talking about, then it's just sort of a brute instrument that is just plain old mistrust. Okay. So you must cultivate the critical mind, and we talk a lot about being a critical thinker, developing a critical mind. I'm sure you've encountered this phrase quite a lot, but I think oftentimes we're not very clear about what that means. So I have developed these questions I think you should keep in mind when you're reading something, when you're considering something, when you're struggling with what you think about a phenomenon or whether or not you think something's true. But these are questions you should be able to bring to almost anything. So first is, what must be true of the world for this explanation, idea, proposal, assertion, whatever, to be true? This is probably the most important question, because you're investigating inherent assumptions. Every idea, every question has an inherent set of assumptions about the way the world works. And oftentimes, oftentimes, if you're debating an idea, you've already given ground to the central tenets of the idea by debating the idea itself. And this is really key in like courtroom, attorney. I think the phrase right now, but when you're arguing a case in court, you're trying to set the bounds of discourse and the bounds of debate. So, in my own research, I study how risk discourse in science became public engagement discourse in science. So there's this idea that we just need to get people to understand how risk works, and then we can have a good conversation with them. And it turns out that didn't work, and specifically it didn't work for making people more trusting in science. And so now there's been sort of this transition towards like, well, let's see what people think about these sciences, and let them just express their concerns. And these are about contentious areas like genetics and nanotechnology. Is one I study a lot. But that took a realization that risk wasn't actually what mattered. And there's whole journals, whole careers, whole university departments, whole academic disciplines that came up around this idea about risk. And it's worth studying. It's fascinating. I love it. But it took a realization that that was an assumption being made. So for every question about, well, how do people assess risk? And how do they think about these kinds of risks? How do these type of demographics think about these type of risks? How does education matter in how you think about risk? It was all risk, 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 risk. And it took somebody finally going, you know what, guys, I don't think risk is actually the thing. I don't think that's what matters most here. And so you will get at those kinds of realizations by first asking, what has to be true of the world for this proposition to be true? And so in that instance, risk has to be what's actually making people afraid, when really it's not a risk. It may be the fact that Chernobyl blew up years ago, and that's what's making them afraid. Okay, so how is someone using a common term? And this again gets at a lot of terms that we use commonly, but maybe don't have a very strict definition. And one of my favorite from the last decade, it's sort of gone down, is like globalization. So everyone's talking about globalization. But it's not clear what you mean by globalization. Are you talking about global capital? Are you talking about global labor movements? Are you talking about what could have been globalization 500 years ago when you had ships bringing spices from the east? Is that globalization? And once you start asking these questions, you realize that you have a lot of problems. What kinds of supporting or counterfactual evidence can I find, or do I already know? So this gets at like my anecdata thing, and this is where anecdata, personal stories, might matter a bit. So if you can already find instances where such and such proposition doesn't hold true, that's valuable. That's data. Now it may not be representative because it depends on how many counterfactuals you have and all that sort of stuff. But it would still be valuable in thinking and bringing a critical mind to the scenario. And the last one sort of in some ways gets to the first, which is how does the question itself frame the issue? And an example of this is what's called push polling. So they'll often do this well actually you'll probably see some results of some push polling coming up pretty soon. So, they'll call someone and be like, which do you like better? Ted Cruz's policy on immigrants or Ted Cruz's policy on, the economy? And you're like, oh, well, I hate both, but I'll say policy and the economy. And then they publish results that are like, 70% of people say they like Ted Cruz's, policy on the economy. Of course, they really don't. And you could think of this for a liberal politician too. Think of this for anything. But given those two very weighted choices, they're forcing someone into a certain kind of answer. And so this isn't just for that, but push polling is a great example where the question forces you into a certain kind of answer that is the data they want, or makes the point that they're really trying to make without actually having to explicitly make that point. I hope there's questions on this. Please have questions on this. Okay. So then you have to be disciplined, which means you actually have to use all these tools, take these points of view and these mindsets, and apply them consistently. So this means basically disconfirming evidence when you find it, for the sociologist, this is what this means for us, is that disconfirming evidence when we find it must be incorporated into models of reality. It cannot be ignored or discarded. So we can't find stuff we don't like and think, well, I'm just going to keep trying, or maybe if I massage the data this way, it'll come out the way I want. And one of my favorite examples of this was first-generation college students. I did some research on how to engage first-generation college students last semester actually, and we're trying to set up sort of an office for first-gens here in Soch. So if you know anybody whose parents did not graduate from college and they are here doing awesome by being here, shoot them our way. We're trying to set something up for them. Anyway, this research, we're trying to understand why first-gens typically get lower grades in their freshman and sophomore years. They catch up in their junior and senior years. which would suggest, of course, that there's not like a cognitive difference. They're not stupider, because by the end they're doing equally. Their per semester GPA is no different than everyone else's, but the first 2 semesters something happens. And so I'm trying to figure this out. And so first gens, unsurprisingly, come from households with lower financial means, and so those students more often have to work, and particularly they work in jobs that aren't very beneficial for their academic career. So, it's not like they work for a lab, or they work for a professor, or they work even in a department. They rather are waiters or waitresses, or they work in a clothing store or whatever. So jobs that aren't really helping them. And so there's this idea that, okay, well, maybe they maybe they work too much, and they are therefore not able to study as much. And so, if they were able to study more, they get better grades. So these researchers, who I was going to cite, and I can look this up if you are interested, use a large national data set, and they study this. And they found that actually first gens study as much, and in sometimes a greater number of hours per week than continuing generation students. And continuing generation are those who have at least one parent who graduated college. So then, that confounded what they were going to think. So what they were trying to say. What they were trying to say was not true. So they had to discard that study. And that's actually one of the problems with all research, even natural science research, but social research as well, is it's hard to publish null findings. So if you're just wrong, there's nowhere really to publish that. So they had to go back to the drawing board. They had to discard their theory in the face of this disconfirming evidence. Actually, first gens study just as much. So now, what is the explanation of this grade? And I was going to have you try to guess and think about what it is. And I think I still am, because I think it's fun. So I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. I want you to dwell on that. Think about what you think the answer really was, because it was surprising. It was fascinating. The counter example, the example of what not to do, I have from a sort of kerfuffle. I can't think of the word again. Scandal. There we go. Scandal that came out this summer from this guy Michael LaCour. And the reason I have the picture with the frowny face is originally I put his picture up there, and I just felt bad for the guy. So I have his picture up there, but I just covered his face with a frowny face. You can look up, what he did if you really want. But basically, he did this study on social activism, and his theory was that his theory was that social activists who are emotionally and personally committed to their issue are more effective than social activists who are just sort of hired. And so he studied this by having people go door to door to talk about gay marriage in California, and not all of California is, liberal, and, to measure these effects. And he created this huge data set, and he found, lo and behold, that if the activist is very committed, emotionally and personally committed to the issue, they are more effective in reaching people who are otherwise resistant to these ideas. Now, this went against major literature in his field, which is political science, by the way, that had shown the opposite, that if it doesn't matter whether the activist cares a lot. Actually, that literature showed that the activist that is most effective in bringing ideas to resistant people are activists that are like the people to whom they're bringing these ideas. So, if you're a 40-year-old unemployed, housewife in La Jolla, another 40-year-old unemployed housewife in La Jolla is going to reach you much more effectively than, in this case, a gay man who wants to get married and cares a lot about gay marriage. The woman who, the 40-year-old housewife in La Jolla who's trying to be reached by these people is not going to care how much that gay man cares about gay marriage. But she will care if someone like her is like, hey, this is really important and here's why. So Michael LaCour's research went against, a lot of research in the field. And so people had, and it was published in Nature. a journal I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's a huge journal for the natural sciences. It was featured on NPR, and so people naturally tried to reproduce it, and then it turned out that they couldn't reproduce it, and then he had destroyed much of his data, and he couldn't. Anyway, sounds like he was kicked out of his program, never got his PhD, and he may have faked a lot of data. So we're not like Michael LaCour. We're more like this first gen study where it shows up wrong, we got to go back and figure it out. Okay, so Berger says sociology has, from its beginnings, understood itself as a science. But what kind of science, I want to say. And we're going to see a little bit more of this when we study Durkheim, because he was also trying to treat it as a science. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social and natural science, talk a little bit about data and theory, talk a little bit about the promise, Mills's the reading we did, or how do you actually do this then? And of course Mills talks about troubles versus problems. He gives 3 types of questions, and I just want to flag norms, values, and beliefs because we're going to talk a lot about, you'll see these come up over and over again, so I want to talk about what they are. So there's a lot of differences between social science and natural science that I think are important to understand, both because it shows the limitations of social science, but also because it shows how we are scientific as far as I think something like our endeavor could ever be scientific. So one of the major differences, and I think Berger talks about this, is our uses of terminology. So science can use terms of art. It can literally make up new words as needed to describe whatever it's describing, and of course it would, because no one knows what a quark is until we discover scientifically a quark. A quark is its own thing. It's a new thing. We never experienced quarks, or we did, but not in any direct way that we knew of. The sociology does not have that luxury. We deal with things that people are familiar with, and so we have to use those familiar terms. If I'm talking about joblessness, lots of people experience joblessness. Globalization might be an example of something that is newish, and that might be a term of art. But again, begs the question: well, how does that differ from all the trade that happened before? And it does in some key ways. But we don't get to make up our own terms ad hoc, willy-nilly, whatever. And in some ways we do, but especially in theory. But sometimes that actually makes it more difficult than less difficult. But also, when you use terms that people are familiar with, they come with baggage. So they come with a lot of meanings that that drive assumptions in people's minds. And so, if you ever get into social theory, you'll use a term and spend a great deal of time specifying, or they will spend a great deal of time specifying precisely what they mean by any given term, so that you know not to make certain assumptions, or to make certain assumptions. I have a thing down there on creating closure. Let me see, go on a second about. Okay. I don't know if I come back to this overall slide, so I'll say that despite everything else you're about to hear in just a moment, we are an empirical, data-driven science. So we are the things I mentioned previously. We are disciplined, we are critical, and we go collect data, and we analyze the data, and we follow what the data tells us. And if the data doesn't tell us what we think, we do the scientific method. We revise our hypotheses. We go back. We try again. We collect more data. We collect different data. Whatever is required. So one of the most important differences I think between the natural science and the social science is what is called creating a closure in science studies literature. And this is the idea that a natural scientist can assume or create special circumstances that don't greatly change the phenomena that they are studying. So in a laboratory, you may have cause to think, to intervene on some disease. And so you may start, if you know the sort of trajectory of that disease, how its pathology works, you might start by just trying to intervene on some small, part of that molecular process. So one molecule's effect on another. And you know that, some molecular, I'm not speaking very well, but some process is crucial to the development of the disease, so you try to intervene on that. And so you may start by introducing a drug that would have another molecule that, just alters that. And then if that works, you may go to the cellular level and look at the petri dish and see if it works on the cellular level. And if that works, you may go to animal trials. And if that works and you get approval from the FDA, you go to human trials. And then if that works, you may go to epidemiological trials and see how it works in different demographics of the population. And the point there is that you can understand that phenomenon by pulling away everything and just layering on complexity. And although it does change how the thing functions in important ways too, which is why we have sort of the FDA clinical trial process, it still tells you something valuable that is useful in actually developing a drug. And of course, it never tells you everything, as I like to say, in FDA drug trials, and clinical trials, you'll never know. The final test is when it hits the populace, because you'll never know, what it does to the guy who eats nothing but tacos every day for his entire diet and, drinks Mountain Dew and, whatever. You just never know how it affects people like that until you hit those people. But there's still something valuable. And then this is a sort of relevant XKCD about physics. I don't think it's the funniest XKCD, but you see this guy going through all kinds of craziness. You don't know what's going on. And at the very end, the dude says, looks like physics professors don't like working in frictionless vacuums after all. And then the last, I think, is a throwaway line. They're such liars. But this is sort of a joke on a common starting assumption for physicists, especially if they're studying mechanics. They start off saying, like, okay, assume a frictionless vacuum. And, here's how stars explode or whatever. And the reason is because you can just safely remove those factors. If you include them, you have to include a friction coefficient, and then suddenly the density and the surface matters, and you have to have measures for those. And it's just a lot of tedious work. You don't actually need to consider that to make whatever point you are trying to make as a physicist. So you can safely remove that stuff, remove that complexity, and then just add it back in, as needed. But sociologists, we don't get that luxury. We can't reasonably remove all the complexity. If I say something like, well, let's just assume that power doesn't matter. Let's just assume everyone's equal. Now we're going to move forward. You can't do that because it changes everything. You can't just reasonably add something like power back in. It changes the fundamental way you ask the question, the fundamental way you conduct your study. I've already quoted Confucius, so I'll quote a little Buddhism. It was like, a Buddhist parable, which is like, if there's a river rushing by and you take out a cup of the river, do you have a cup of the river? No, you have a cup of water. The water has ceased to be the river, and that's sort of the problem we face. If we were to take out some of the river of this social phenomena, this great grand experiment that I talked about out, we're not holding the phenomenon anymore. We're looking at a snapshot. Now, to some degree, we have to do this because, of course, we can't actually include all the complexity. And this sort of gets back at the use of terms I just talked about. So if you ever read any social theory, if you read sort of high-level sociological studies, which I think we have a couple, you'll see a lot of explanations about, okay, here's why I'm not considering power in this circumstance, or here's why, whatever. You specify as best you can. Because, of course, you can't take in all the factors that influence a social phenomenon. Because there will always be power and history and, politics that happens, across the Atlantic that will matter for what's happening here today, even if you don't know it. But you have to make these decisions. You have to make them explicit. But generally, we can't just remove everything and then put it back in. The one sort of shining counterexample to this in the social sciences, which we will address later in the term, is rational actor theory. And this starts with the assumption that people basically make decisions to improve their, to benefit themselves, well, to literally improve their utils, but to make decisions that benefit them personally, and they have more or less perfect access to information to do so. And this is very prominent in economics, and it allows for certain kinds of models, and that's basically why it's still used, because it makes nice models that have high statistical significance, but they have lots of problems. I mean, as you can sort of judge by the economy, it has lots of problems when actually put down into reality. So we'll talk about more of that when we talk about rational actor theory. The point here is, though, that we cannot create a laboratory closure or even an epistemological closure, and that means a closure in our way of thinking, like the physicist does, in the same way as the natural sciences. So norms, values, and beliefs. So, do I have another slide on this? Okay, so one of the things I want to highlight was way back here when, I don't think I actually said it, but Berger says that we study the doings of men. And so when we study, and of course women too, he wrote in an era when all people were men, studying the doings of men and women means that you must account for things like norms, values, and beliefs. Norms, values, and beliefs, however, are not objective factors. They're not like particles and elements and vector forces. They're not like enzymatic reactions. They're not these reliable things that function nice and neatly for models. They are changing. They're influenced by all kinds of crazy factors. They influence one another. And so here's another reason why the very elements of what sociology deals with is tough to quantify necessarily in a reliable way. And again, we do. And you can take stats to see how, but it's, a lot of care and love has gone into how you develop this. So what's my point here? So I just want to give a quick definition, though, of norms, values, and beliefs, because you'll encounter this a lot. So norms are socially acceptable or expected behavior, action, or modes of thought. So these are things that you just expect to do. If I am behind you entering a building, you will, if you're not a total jerk, you will hold the door for me. That's just normal. It's what you do. Values, however, are socially desirable behavior, actions, or thought. And I have that little not equal sign because these aren't necessarily the same thing. What can be generally valued and desirable is not necessarily what is acceptable, and vice versa. And to illustrate this, I always think of being honest. We generally value honesty. We want people to be honest, but you're not honest in every situation. So, if I'm on a date and, my date's mom makes us dinner, we go to her parents' house or whatever, and it's absolutely god-awful, and, I can barely stuff it down my throat, and they say, how's the dinner? Despite my valuing honesty, I'm not going to say, wow, this is some of the worst food I've ever put in my mouth. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, it's great. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. whatever. So the norm is, in that case, conflicts with the value, which is you want everything to be sort of socially, easygoing. And a belief, of course, is something you consider to be true of the world and that drives your thought and or action. And this, too, doesn't necessarily always jive with your values and your norms. I think we'll talk mostly about norms or that will come up more often than in the others, because that is sort of fascinating. Because norms mean people don't think about them anymore. People act according to them, but you don't even necessarily know why you do it. One norm, this isn't a behavior, but that I like and I always wonder if people know is, sepia in movies where everything's yellow, and that's used to sort of denote ancient time, like the olden days and stuff. This is one of the questions I'd love to ask you guys, but I can't because I'm recording this. But, why do you think it's sepia? Well, it's sepia because photographs, when they used to age, would turn yellow. And so the past always looked yellowish in however our only way of seeing it. But of course, in the age of digital photos, I think most of you are born, past the capacity of digital photos. That doesn't happen anymore. And so I just sort of find it interesting that sepia is still used in movies to denote olden times, when the whole reason for that is now, I think, largely forgotten. So that's just a norm. Something we do, we don't know why. And so for the sociologist, sort of cracking open norms and figuring out why, or even just figuring out what happens when norms are violated, tells you a lot about the social system. It tells you a lot about the underlying values and the underlying beliefs. And we'll see more of this when we do Goffman and Garfinkel and symbolic interactionism. So since we are a science, we use data and we use theory. And Berger says that he's talking about statistics, so sort of statistical data only becomes sociology when they are sociologically interpreted and put within a theoretical frame of reference that is sociological. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that theory drives the formation of our question. So this comes even before you approach any data, and this is very important. Your questions always drive theory, theory drives the question, and the question must drive your research. And then theory drives the interpretation of the outcome. And it's usually the same theory that drove you to the question, unless you've changed it because you learned something along the way in analyzing the data, and that's pretty common. A big exception to this now is big data, where you don't necessarily come with any question. And this is sort of, I think, a statistical sin. You don't come with any real question, you just come and crunch a bunch of stuff and just sort of see what happens. That's not what we're supposed to do, because it's easy to, especially when you have a ton of data, to find something that looks significant as a correlation, but is actually meaningless. And so here's a couple of examples that I like. This comes from tylervegan.com, down below you can see in the bottom right, and he has a whole book of these. So here, U.S. spending on science, space, and technology correlates very strongly with suicides by hanging, stringing, and suffocation. So now this is absurd, so it's easy to see that there's clearly no connection with these. It's not like the NASA program, this is, I guess, after the NASA program. The Human Genome Project, science, space, and technology, sorry. Whatever large project we've been doing. Shuttle launches somehow drives people to commit suicide, nor is it the case that when people commit suicide, they're somehow improving our spending on science and space and technology. These clearly have nothing to do with each other. But if you're talking about something like educate, I'm only going to be able to think of things that actually are related, but if you're thinking of something like education and likelihood to have visited abroad or something, those probably are related, but they may not be really. But if you don't have a good question, if you don't have a good theory of how the world works that's driving your approach to data, you can find this stuff that seems to support what you think. And you'll, after the fact, post hoc, rationalize it in some way, come up with a theory that fits the data you find. And that's, again, a cardinal sin. So here's just another one, it's a little close to home. Worldwide non-commercial space launches and sociology doctorates awarded to the U.S. So, all these space launches are making sociologists, or sociologists are making all the space launches, one or the other. Just seeing how much, not much left. You're almost done. So then there's the 3 questions that Mills gives us, which is, what is the structure of the society as a whole? Where does society stand in human history? And what varieties of men and women now prevail, and what kinds of human nature are revealed in this society? So I'll just say that, like, notice what's happening here. We're taking a snapshot. The first one is taking a snapshot of the society in a moment in time. The second one is putting it in a process of history to see how it has changed over time, and history is very close to what we do. And then the final is looking at the power structure, and particularly, I like this, what kinds of human nature are revealed. So it shows that there's multiple human natures operating, but ultimately it's, what can we say about the fundamental nature of humanity? So here's this society we're looking at this moment that seems to be this way, and we can understand this in context of history and where it came from and maybe where it's going. And then, what does this say about us? What is this telling us about our capacities, our natures? This is also important, which is the nature of troubles versus problems. Well, I won't say why it comes up in class so much. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Later we'll see. But troubles are more personal issues that affect you or only a relatively small contingent of people. Sociologists doesn't deal with troubles. We deal in problems, issues that affect a great number of people, a certain demographic, or are consistent throughout history. So, and it's not just because it benefits the greatest number of people or whatever. It's not a utilitarian argument. It's just because that's what helps us understand the nature of society. So if you get fired from your job, that sucks, but that's not going to help us understand the full nature of humanity. But if unemployment is at 9%, that's a problem. That's huge. That's when we need to figure out what's going on in society. And sometimes the boundaries can be fuzzy because there's always some measure of unemployment, for instance. And so you may have to establish that you're actually dealing with a problem or trouble. But not every bad thing that happens to someone is necessarily a trouble. And I'm going to save this inequality versus inequity argument from Susan Cousins. I really like it, but I'm going to save it for another day. And then this is something I want you to think about for next time. It was going to be a question that I had you guys work on in groups and end with. So how do you think the sociologist differs from the journalist, the philosopher, the statistician, and the historian? You can think of this sort of like a Venn diagram. Maybe each pairing is a Venn diagram, but we have a lot in common with each of these, but we're not entirely doing what each of these people do. So I want you to think about that for next time, and I apologize again for not being able to be there. If you all get the message. Have a good weekend, long weekend. I'll see you Wednesday.